Hi. How's everybody doing? It's gorgeous outside. Oh well. All right, yeah, so shifting gears to talk about birds a little bit. One theme that will be sort of carried through my talk here is that the spatial scale in which birds interact with the environment is different, considerably larger than the spatial scale over which the invertebrates interact with the environment, which we've heard about in the previous couple of talks. So I think that might explain some of the differences that emerge here, as you'll see. All right, so what I'll talk about briefly, just go over the purpose of the work and some of the methods we employed, then talk about preliminary analyses. We're still collecting data. We're going to collect data for 6 or more months. By we, I mean my students and I. And so we'll do more sophisticated analysis as the rest gets completed. And then interpret what data we've analyzed so far, and then some closing thoughts, acknowledgments, and questions. So the purpose of this work at the onset was just to document the bird use of Spartina densiflora-dominated salt marsh habitats, collect and analyze the data, and disseminate the results. As much as feasible, we wanted to also try to compare native salt marsh to Spartina-dominated salt marsh. What's the major challenge with that? There is very little native salt marsh, right? Especially when you're talking about at the scale relevant to birds, because they're using a big area, so you need a big chunk of it to be able to get replicates of bird surveys in there to be able to make those comparisons. So, but we're trying to do that, and obviously as more and more Spartina gets removed and as the years go on, we ought to be able to make these comparisons better in the future using some of the data I'll present now as baseline data. And then when the money was awarded to Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge for the Spartina eradication, we changed the project a little bit, extended the duration, added a few more points to try to make sure we really were going to get some good baseline data and to make those comparisons down the line. So we established 24 bird survey points. 13 of them are in areas that are heavily dominated by Spartina. The 11 are either in restored sites, specifically the Mad River Slough sites, or not so dominated. Hereafter, I'll just call those native, which is really maybe not a very good word, because they are not native salt marsh. They still have a lot of Spartina on them, although some of them now have been removed of Spartina in their various stages of mud and debris, as you guys have heard. All right, so here's those points. Mad River Slough there in the center. Those are 3 of the restored sites, and those had been restored far enough back in time that the native marsh really had recovered. Eureka Slough, as you heard a number of times, is pretty heavily infested by Spartina. Jacoby Creek, we squeezed in 3 points that were in not so heavily infested Spartina, and then whatever that is, 5 in heavily dominated Spartina. So red here, I guess I should say, is the Spartina-dominated salt marsh, and the yellow is the quote-unquote native. And then a few points on the islands next to Eureka. Okay, so in terms of our bird counts, we just do what's called a point count, and that is where the bird biologist stands in one point and counts the birds around him or her. We record all the data in these concentric circles, which I tried to make a cartoon of here. So we've got a number of distances, and when we complete the final analyses, there's ways to try to account for imperfect probabilities of detection, which vary amongst the different taxa of birds. But for today, what I've done for the analysis just in the interim is to just chop everything off at 50 meters. So it's just all the birds that we detected within 50 meters. And it gets complicated in a number of settings when that 50 meters encompasses both areas with plenty of vegetation and then areas that are either mudflat or open water, depending on the tide. And so I haven't done very sophisticated analyses yet on the water birds. I'll show you just one figure today, but I've really concentrated, at least today, on the birds that we're detecting in the vegetation. So in the area that has the Spartina or soon to be removed of Spartina, if it hasn't already been. All right. So preliminary results, what I want to show you here is just a series of figures where the y-axis is the number of birds detected per survey station within 50 meters. And I'm focusing for the next few figures on these, whatever this, 6 or 8 species. And in each case, the yellow bar is going to be the birds in the quote-unquote native salt marsh, and red bar will be the birds in the Spartina marsh. So to get you a visual of what these little critters look like, marsh wren, savanna sparrow, and song sparrow are all small birds, insect eating and seed eating, especially seed eating for the 2 sparrows in the salt marsh. Virginia rail and sora, these are invertebrate eating birds that are very thin as a rail, and walk through the salt marsh, staying down in the vegetation. Pretty secretive. You hear them a bit more than you see them. Red-winged blackbird and white-crowned sparrows, which are abundant here all year long, but especially in the winter months. And then the northern harrier, which is a raptor that will feed on rodents as well as some of these birds and perhaps some shorebirds as well. And the data I'm going to show you today are the data from spring and summer and fall of 2010 plus spring and summer of 2011. We've completed the fall 2011 data, but I haven't incorporated them here yet. Plus, that's when the data get more and more complicated because more and more of the marsh has been restored at that point. So this simplifies the comparisons a little bit. Okay, so what do you think? More birds in the Spartina or more birds in the not-so-Spartina, the native? Okay, so here's where these turn out. Few more, so I did ANOVAs on log transform data. So marsh wrens more common in the Spartina, savanna sparrows and song sparrows, and white-crowned sparrows all more common in the Spartina than in the not-so-Spartina habitats. This is in the spring. In all, I tried to keep the y-axis on the same scale for the 3 seasons here. The summer, a few fewer bird detections, perhaps as many birds, but a few fewer detections. But again, relatively similar pattern, more marsh wrens, more savanna sparrows, and more song sparrows, so I guess it wasn't significant in that case. In the Spartina. And then in the fall, that's where you really see more birds. We get an influx of non-breeding birds. And so it gets especially dramatic for savanna sparrows. And then that's when the red-winged blackbirds show up in pretty large numbers in the Spartina, and they're essentially absent from the native marsh. Okay. So overall, this is just raw averages. I didn't run any stats on this, but just so you can see the general pattern, fairly clear. Shorebirds and waterfowl overall. So this is sweeping a lot of variability under the rug, and I plan to pull the rug back and try to disentangle some of that variability later as I do more sophisticated analyses. But the shorebirds and waterfowl are really strongly influenced by all sorts of things. Tides, which I didn't mention. Most of these, well, virtually all of these surveys are a 6-foot tide or less, but we have a variety of tides within that range. So we tried to capture the variation that we were seeing over this 18 months or so of data. These are some, Dunlin is a species of shorebird. Peeps is just a word to describe a bunch of different shorebird species. Dabblers, this would refer to ducks that tip this way. If you've ever seen ducks swim in the water and have their butts up in the air, those are the dabbling species that stick their necks underwater and feed on vegetation primarily. And then some diving species like grebes and some sea ducks. And so you can see in general there are lots of variation and no strong tendencies for there to be more birds in the Spartina or not so Spartina. All right, interpretation. So for several bird species, especially those small seed and insect-eating songbirds, there were more birds detected in the Spartina-dominated marsh than in the quote-unquote native marsh. The abundance of rails was as high or higher in the Spartina-dominated salt marsh I at first thought that was going to be the opposite way, and it seemed like that the first few surveys, but now that we've got a year or more's worth of data, it hasn't turned out to be. So there's at least as many in the Spartina-dominated salt marsh. Abundances of shorebirds and waterfowl are highly variable and not apparently linked strongly to vegetation, at least that we can see so far. Okay, so those are some of the preliminary results we have. Why might we be seeing those patterns? A couple things emerge. One is the structure of the habitat, especially at the scale relevant to birds. I think the Spartina is providing some cover for the birds. And then secondly, seed source. I think the Spartina is providing some food for birds through its seeds. So competitively dominant, supposed to be dominant, invasive plants can increase biomass of an ecosystem, of a habitat, but in so doing often reduce plant species diversity because they become competitively dominant. How does this affect animals? Well, that question really brings up this long-standing debate in ecology about what structures animal communities. Is it floristics, the plant species composition of a habitat, or the structure or physiognomy of a habitat? And famous ecologists have tried to settle that debate for 4 or more or 5 decades. And so in the context here, the question really is, well, what has more structure? This sort of habitat or this sort of habitat? Again, it's going to depend on the scale that you're talking about, the grain specifically that you're talking about. And the consensus view amongst ecologists is that animal communities are more strongly affected by physiognomy than by plant species composition. But as the spatial extent and grain shrink, floristics, the exact species assemblage, becomes increasingly important. And I think that's really at play here. So at the scale relevant to birds, the Spartina-dominated habitats provide more structure. There's just more habitat there. It's architecturally, well, I'm not going to say complex. That's not quite the right word. There's just more of it there. There's more structure, there's more physiognomy, there's more cover, and the birds are responding to that. But if you zoom in and look at a much finer spatial grain, as Matt was describing a few minutes ago, there's considerably more complexity, physiognomic complexity at a small scale in the native marsh. But that scale's not particularly relevant to birds, I don't think. The birds are at a slightly larger scale, so there's more structure in that Spartina. That's what I think is going on. Okay, and then the seed production. Seed production in late summer and fall was coincident with very large numbers of seed-eating bird species, the red-winged blackbirds, the white-crowned sparrows, the savanna sparrows, and the song sparrows. That's a Nelson's sharp-tailed sparrow, and I don't think that's densiflora. I'm not sure. Is it? Maybe? It's from, I think the photo's from back east somewhere, but anyway, got it off the internet. It's a good shot. So bird queuing in on the seeds there. And as Desiree said a few talks ago, Spartina produces a lot of seeds, right? Up to 6 million seeds per acre. So birds are certainly responding to that, at least over the temporal scale of the late summer, early fall. And I think that's largely a bottom-up effect. That is, the seed production is affecting the birds. I think it's relatively unlikely that the birds are going to have a top-down effect on the plant. I don't think they're seed dispersers either. They're seed predators, but whatever seeds they're eating is probably not enough to have any effect, top-down effect. That's my hunch anyway. Okay, so closing thoughts. We'll continue to survey birds through the spring of 2012. The money holds out, we might even be able to go longer than that. We haven't been going through it as fast as I first thought, so we might be able to continue through the summer. Additional data on Spartina cover, especially as it's now being removed, will enable some more nuanced analyses. It's also good probably to point out that high bird abundance does not necessarily indicate high quality habitat. Biology student, wildlife students always hear this over and over again. Density is not necessarily an indicator of high quality habitat. Just because there's a lot of birds doesn't necessarily mean it's a great habitat for them. And in fact, a study by Cully Nordby down in San Francisco found that the song sparrows, even though they were relatively abundant, weren't reproducing very well in Spartina alterniflora dominated salt marshes because the marsh wrens were eating the song sparrow's eggs. So you start to get some interesting things that could be going on. If Spartina were to be allowed to invade into the mudflat, densiflora is not as good as doing that as alterniflora, but that probably would affect shorebird foraging habitat. Whether shorebirds are limited by foraging habitat is another question. And then also it's worth pointing out that the bird species in this study are fairly common regionally. So there's not any endangered species or pressing species of conservation concern that I've gone over today. There are a few, well, there's just snowy plover and so on, but they're not using this sort of habitat much. Okay, I think with that, a few acknowledgments. I'd like to thank the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for funding, especially Paula Golightly. Rob Fowler, Brent Compost, Tony Kurz, and Sasha Heath helped with the bird surveys. Allison, Andrea, and Sharon for organizing this symposium. And there's a few references, and I think there should